There are moments when a baseball game stops being a baseball game. When the whistles and the signals and the official machinery of professional sport interrupt the competition and remind everyone present that what happens on a baseball field is governed by rules. By standards. By a code of conduct that exists precisely because the intensity of elite competition, left entirely ungoverned, produces moments that cross lines that the sport cannot afford to have crossed in front of thousands of witnesses and millions of viewers. Most ejections in professional baseball are processed quickly. An argument that escalates past the acceptable threshold. A manager who steps too far onto the field. A player whose frustration with a call produces language or gesture that the umpiring crew determines requires an official response. These things happen. They are noted. They generate brief commentary and then dissolve into the larger flow of a season that produces 250 such incidents without any of them becoming something that the sport's institutional leadership is required to treat as a crisis. What happened in this game was not that kind of ejection. 2 ejections. Back to back. From the same team. From players described universally by the Cubs organization as key contributors. Not fringe roster players whose removal creates no meaningful competitive disruption. Key players. The kind whose absence from a lineup or a bullpen changes the calculation of what a team can accomplish on a given night. Both of them ejected for consecutive fouls against the same person. Shohei Ohtani. And in the hours that followed, in the space where the official consequences of what happened were being processed and the organizational response was being constructed and the baseball world was beginning to understand the full scope of what had occurred, something happened in the Cubs' locker room that nobody anticipated. Seiya Suzuki, who had been present for everything. Who had witnessed both incidents from the proximity of a teammate. Who had stood close enough to understand not just what had happened but how it had happened and what it communicated about the intent behind it. Seiya Suzuki, one of the most composed and professionally measured players on the Cubs roster, threw his uniform. Not metaphorically. Not in the figurative sense that athletes sometimes use to describe emotional intensity. He threw it. Physically. With a force that communicated everything he could not say within the structured boundaries of his professional obligations. And then the facts began to emerge. Facts that the people initially processing the situation had not anticipated. Facts that transformed what had begun as a story about 2 ejections into something that reached the highest levels of the sport's institutional authority. Facts that produced, in the assessment of officials who have spent careers applying the standards of professional conduct to the most difficult situations the sport produces, a determination that what had occurred was not simply serious. It was historic in the worst possible way. Lifetime ban. 2 words that professional baseball players spend entire careers never hearing in relation to themselves. 2 words that represent the most severe consequence the sport possesses. The complete, permanent, irrevocable removal of everything a person has built within the professional game. So what exactly happened on that field? What did 2 Cubs players do in consecutive incidents that produced consecutive ejections and the most serious disciplinary conversation the sport has had in years? And what does Seiya Suzuki's reaction in the locker room reveal about the true nature of what he witnessed? To understand how this arrived at lifetime ban, you first have to understand what consecutive fouls against Ohtani actually means in this context. Nothing in the first several innings of the game suggested that it was building toward anything beyond the normal competitive intensity of 2 professional rosters trying to win a baseball game. The Cubs had come in with a plan. Their preparation had been thorough. Their execution in the early innings was professional and focused. The energy in their dugout was the settled, concentrated energy of a team that believes in what it is doing and is doing it with sufficient competence to sustain that belief. The first incident occurred in the middle innings. The Cubs player involved had been having a difficult day by his own standards. The kind of day where the mechanics feel slightly off and the results reflect that slight misalignment in ways that compound across at-bats. Frustration had been building quietly, in the way that frustration builds in professional athletes who hold themselves to standards that a difficult day makes temporarily unreachable. The frustration found an outlet. Not through the normal competitive channels. Not through the aggressive focus that athletes are trained to redirect negative energy toward. Through something more specific and more deliberate. A foul directed not at the competition in the broad sense but at Ohtani in the specific sense. The umpiring crew responded immediately. The crew chief, a veteran official with decades of experience processing exactly these kinds of moments, did not hesitate. Did not issue a warning. Did not provide the informal signal that sometimes precedes formal action, the look or the word or the small gesture that tells a player they are approaching a line without yet having crossed it. The ejection was immediate because the foul was unambiguous. Deliberate. Targeted. In violation of standards that professional baseball has maintained and enforced because the sport understands that allowing certain categories of behavior to go unaddressed, even once, communicates something about those standards that the sport cannot afford to communicate. The Cubs player argued briefly. The argument was the argument of a person who knows they have no case but needs to perform the objection anyway. It changed nothing. He was gone. And the Cubs dugout, absorbing the ejection of a key player, might have recovered its equilibrium if what happened next had not immediately followed. Professional athletes have a specific kind of awareness that develops over years of competing in high-pressure environments. An awareness of momentum. Of the way energy moves through a competition. Of the particular vulnerability that follows a significant emotional moment, when the people involved are still processing what just happened and have not fully reassembled the focused composure that elite performance requires. The second Cubs player made his decision in exactly that window. Whether it was planned, coordinated with the first incident in some prior conversation, or whether it was the impulsive act of a person caught in the emotional current of watching a teammate ejected for targeting the same individual, is something that the official investigation has been examining since the moment the facts began to emerge. What is not in question is what happened. A second foul against Ohtani. Consecutive. From the same team. With the first ejection still fresh in the stadium's atmosphere. With the umpiring crew already at the highest level of alertness that an incident like the first one produces in officials who take their responsibility to protect the integrity of the game seriously. The second ejection came faster than the first. No argument this time. The player who had just been ejected seemed to understand, in the moment after the crew chief's signal, that argument was not simply futile but would make the situation that was already developing into something serious considerably worse. He left the field in silence. And the stadium, which had been processing the first ejection with the noise and energy that significant moments generate, went through something different after the second. A particular kind of quiet. The quiet of a large group of people simultaneously recognizing that what they are witnessing has moved past the range of things that normal competitive emotional responses explain. Two key Cubs players. Consecutive incidents. The same target. This was not coincidence. This was not the parallel frustration of two players independently reaching their breaking points within minutes of each other in a way that happened to produce the same outcome directed at the same person. This was something organized. And the umpiring crew, communicating with the league office through the channels that exist for exactly these situations, began the process of treating it accordingly. Seiya Suzuki had watched both incidents from a position of proximity that gave him complete and unobstructed understanding of what had happened. Not the partial view of a player positioned at a distance who processes the incident through the reactions of others before accessing the incident itself. Suzuki had been close enough to see clearly. To hear clearly. To understand not just the mechanics of what had occurred but the intention behind it. And what he understood made him furious in a way that the professional composure he has developed over years of competition in the highest levels of the sport was completely unable to contain. The locker room account has been provided by multiple witnesses independently. Suzuki entered the space with a controlled exterior that those who know him recognized immediately as the specific kind of control that is more dangerous than open agitation. The control of a person who is holding something very large very tightly and whose grip is already beginning to fail. He sat at his locker. Remained still for a period that witnesses described as lasting longer than it should have. The stillness of someone engaged in an internal argument between the professional standards they have spent a career building and the human reaction that those standards are struggling to suppress. And then the stillness ended. The uniform came off. Not in the ordinary way that players remove their uniforms at the end of a game. With force. With the specific physical expression of an emotional state that has exceeded the capacity of any professional framework to contain. It traveled across the locker room in the particular arc of something thrown rather than discarded. The players near him described the silence that followed as absolute. The complete cessation of the normal locker room sounds and conversations and movements that continue regardless of what happens on the field. Everyone in that space understood what they were witnessing and understood that it required a response different from the normal navigation of a teammate's emotional moment. Nobody moved immediately. Because what Suzuki said in the silence after the uniform landed is what made everyone present understand that the two ejections they had watched from the field were the visible portion of something that had a much larger and much more serious structure beneath it. He said he had known something was coming. He said he had seen it being discussed. Had heard conversations that he had processed at the time as the frustration of competitive athletes rather than the planning of something deliberate. Had made the professional calculation that what he was observing was within the range of normal competitive aggression that teammates sometimes express and that usually dissipates before it produces anything actionable. He had been wrong. And the weight of having been wrong, of having witnessed the planning and processed it as something it was not and then watched the consequences unfold in front of thousands of people, was what the uniform absorbed when it left his hands. What the official investigation began to uncover in the hours following the two ejections is the portion of this story that has traveled farthest and generated the most serious institutional response. The facts, as they emerged through the formal process that the league office initiated immediately following the second ejection, were not the facts of two players making independent poor decisions in the heat of competitive frustration. They were the facts of coordination. Pre-game conversations, documented through the accounts of multiple witnesses and through the review of communications that the official process has the authority to examine, established a timeline that transformed the interpretation of everything that had happened on the field. The two incidents had been discussed before the game began. Not in the vague, general terms of competitive aggression that athletes sometimes use to motivate themselves and each other. In specific terms. With specific intent directed at a specific individual. The word that officials reviewing this information kept returning to, according to people familiar with the investigation, was premeditated. That word changes everything. A spontaneous act of frustration, however serious its consequences, is processed by the sport's disciplinary apparatus within one framework. A premeditated act, planned before the competition began and executed according to a prior agreement between multiple individuals, is processed within an entirely different framework. A framework that contains, at its most severe end, the consequence that the baseball world has been discussing since the facts began to emerge. Lifetime ban. The threshold for that consequence is deliberately set at a level that most career-defining incidents do not reach. The sport does not apply its most severe penalty to serious incidents. It reserves that penalty for incidents that, in the assessment of the people responsible for maintaining the standards the sport depends on, cannot be addressed with anything less without communicating something false about what those standards actually mean. The facts that emerged from this investigation crossed that threshold. Both ejected players issued apologies. The timing and the content of those apologies have been examined carefully by the people involved in the official process and by the observers outside it who understand what apologies in these situations typically communicate about the awareness of the people making them. The apologies came quickly. Within hours of the ejections. Before the full scope of the investigation had been publicly established. Before the facts that would ultimately shape the institutional response had been widely reported. Quick apologies in situations like this one communicate specific things. They communicate awareness. The person apologizing knows, before anyone has told them officially, that what they did was serious enough to require a response that goes beyond the normal processing of an ejection. They are not waiting for the investigation to establish what happened. They know what happened. They were there when it was planned. The content of the apologies was carefully constructed. Acknowledging the ejections. Expressing regret for the impact on the team. Using the specific language of professional accountability that experienced people learn over careers spent in organizations where public statements have consequences. What the apologies did not contain is as significant as what they did. Neither apology addressed the premeditation. Neither apology acknowledged the conversations that took place before the game. Neither apology reached the depth of what the investigation was simultaneously establishing through its own process. They were the apologies of two people who understood they had been caught. Not the apologies of two people who understood what they had actually done. The distinction matters to the officials processing the situation. It matters to Seiya Suzuki, who heard about both apologies and whose reaction was described by the people present for it as the opposite of reassured. And it matters to Ohtani, who has been kept informed of every development through the official channels and who has, by every account available, maintained the composure and clarity of someone who trusts the process he has put his faith in. Professional baseball's institutional response to this situation has been, by the standards of an organization that typically moves deliberately and carefully through its most serious disciplinary matters, unusually swift. The speed of the response communicates the severity of the assessment. Organizations that are uncertain about how seriously to treat a situation move slowly through their process. They gather information. They consult. They allow time to create distance from the emotional intensity of the immediate moment before making determinations that will become permanent parts of the record. Organizations that are not uncertain move faster. The league office's communications in the days following the ejections have indicated a level of institutional seriousness that the baseball world has not encountered for a significant period. The specific language used in those communications, which have reached both organizations through official channels and portions of which have become known to reporters covering the investigation, has not left meaningful interpretive room. The facts established by the investigation support the most serious available response. Whether that response ultimately takes the form of a lifetime ban, or whether the process produces a determination that falls short of that threshold while still representing the most severe sanction applied in the sport for many years, is something that the official process will determine through its own timeline and its own standards. But the direction of the process is not ambiguous to anyone who has been following it closely. The baseball world is watching an institution use its most serious tools in response to something it has determined required nothing less. Seiya Suzuki picked up his uniform. At some point after the locker room had processed the immediate shock of what had happened. After the conversations that follow extraordinary moments had run their course and the space had returned to something approaching its normal function. He picked it up quietly. Folded it in the deliberate way of someone performing an ordinary act as a way of reasserting some control over a moment that had temporarily removed all control from him. He did not speak further about what he had witnessed or what he had said or what his uniform had communicated when it left his hands and traveled across the room. He didn't need to. Everyone who had been present already understood. Everyone who heard the account afterward understood. Because Suzuki's reaction was not the reaction of a player processing a difficult loss or a frustrating game or the ordinary competitive disappointments that a professional baseball season distributes in abundance. It was the reaction of a person who had watched something happen to someone he respects and cares about. Someone he has known through the specific bond that forms between players who share a background and a language and the particular experience of navigating American professional baseball from the outside. He had watched it happen. And he had not stopped it. That is what the uniform absorbed. Ohtani, through all of it, has remained what he always remains. Present. Prepared. Focused on what comes next rather than what has just passed. Working with the official process that he initiated and trusts to arrive at a response that is proportionate to what occurred. 2 key Cubs players ejected. Apologies filed and assessed. An investigation producing facts that shocked the people uncovering them. A lifetime ban being discussed at the highest levels of the sport's institutional authority. And at the center of all of it, unchanged by any of it in the ways that actually matter, is the person it was all directed at. Shohei Ohtani. Who showed up for the next game prepared? Who will show up for every game after that prepared? Because the people who try to destabilize him through the most severe means available to them consistently discover the same thing. He cannot be destabilized. Not by fouls. Not by ejections. Not by locker rooms in chaos and uniforms thrown and shocking facts revealed and lifetime bans discussed in the highest offices of the sport. He simply prepares. And then he plays. And the scoreboard, indifferent to everything that happened off it, records the result. It always has. It always will. That is who Shohei Ohtani is. And no consecutive foul, from any number of Cubs players, in any game, in any stadium, will ever change it.